It's late. Whatever you should be doing, it can wait. You found the graveyard slot, stories for the hours nobody claims. It's just us now. Tonight's story, route marker 9. It arrived as 11 handwritten pages with mile counts in the margins. The sender says he still counts everything. We read them as written. Let's begin. I quit my job at the stockroom on a Tuesday, and by Thursday morning I was in Dell's passenger seat with a road atlas, older than either of us, open on my knees. And if you'd asked me right then what I was doing with my life, I would have told you, completely straight-faced, that I was doing this. Not taking a break before figuring things out, not between things. This, the drive. Dell and me, one car, one direction at a time, for as long as we could stretch it before he had to be in Denver for a job that came with a badge and a parking spot and, I assumed, the eventual slow erosion of a friendship that had survived 9-year-old bicycle crashes and one bad breakup apiece, and had never once, in 16 years, needed a scheduled phone call to stay alive. I want to say that up front, because I think it matters for understanding why I did some of the things I did later, and why I didn't do some of the things I should have. This trip wasn't a vacation from my life. It was, structurally speaking, the only plan I had. I didn't have a job to go back to. I didn't have an apartment lined up. I had a duffel bag, $400-something, and a best friend who was about to become a long-distance phone call twice a month if I let it, and I was not going to let it. And so the drive itself, the actual mileage, the number of days we could make it last, had become, in some part of my head I wasn't examining too closely, the only thing standing between me and finding out what our friendship was worth once it wasn't convenient anymore. I mention this because I counted miles, out loud sometimes, which Dell found either endearing or insufferable depending on the hour. It was a habit from childhood, car sick as a kid, and counting mile markers was the thing that kept my stomach where it belonged. And it had calcified into something I did, without noticing, the way some people crack their knuckles. 640 from home to the first stop, 290 more to the second. I want you to remember that I was the one keeping count, because it's going to matter, and because for one specific stretch of this trip the numbers stopped adding up to anything at all, and I was the only one who would have noticed. The atlas was my grandfather's. Rand McNally, 1987. Spine cracked soft as cloth. Corners gone round from 40 years in glove boxes. He died the winter before, and going through his truck my mother had told me to just throw it out. It's useless now. Everyone has phones, and I'd taken it instead, because it felt like taking something of him rather than because I thought I'd ever use it. I kept it in Dell's glove box the whole trip, as what I would have called, if you pushed me, a good luck charm. There was a brown ring on page 14, roughly the size of a mug bottom, and I'd always assumed it was coffee, the kind of stain that just happens to old books that ride around in trucks, and I want to be honest that I did not think about that stain again. Really think about it until it was much too late to matter. Dell's contribution to the pre-trip mythology, the thing he told me grinning somewhere around hour 2, was that his dad had done basically this exact drive back in college, some cross-country thing with buddies, and come home a week later than planned with a story that amounted to, we got turned around, and nothing more specific than that, ever, no matter how many times as kids we'd asked for details because we thought it sounded like an adventure. Dell told it like a punchline. His dad, tight-lipped and mild-mannered accountant, Dell's dad having one uncharacteristic week of chaos in his early 20s and refusing on principle to elaborate. I laughed. I want to be honest about that too. I thought it was funny. I did not think of it as information. I should say more about what Dell actually was to me, because I don't think the rest of this makes sense otherwise. We met at 9 years old over a shared bicycle helmet, his cracked in a fall, mine loaned to him for the walk home because my mother wouldn't let me ride bareheaded even for 4 blocks, and something about that transaction apparently wired us together for good. We'd been the kind of friends who didn't require maintenance. Years could go sideways. His parents divorced when we were 14, my own year of barely leaving my room after a breakup at 22, and neither of us ever had to schedule the friendship back into existence afterward. It was just there, the way weather is there. What terrified me about Denver wasn't Denver. It was the schedule. The idea of a friendship that had never once needed an appointment suddenly needing one twice a month, penciled in around somebody else's dinner plans. I'd built this whole trip. If I'm honest with myself in a way, I wasn't quite ready to be honest with him, as a hedge against that. One last stretch of time large enough that nothing about it could be scheduled, only lived through, so that whatever came after would at least have this underneath it. I bring that up here because it's the reason I made every decision I made over the next 4 days the way I made it. A more sensible person, less afraid of losing something that mattered to him, would have turned around the first time a receipt printed a date that made no sense. I didn't, and I don't fully believe anymore that the atlas or the dead cell signal or even the road itself was the only reason we kept going. Some of it was just me, not wanting the trip to end a single hour sooner than it had to, even once the trip had very clearly turned into something else. We were 2 states in and thoroughly off the interstate, deep into the kind of 2-lane country where towns exist mostly as a speed limit sign and a boarded diner, when the phone died. Not the battery, the signal. Both our phones at once dropped every bar in the same quarter mile, which should not happen with 2 different carriers, though neither of us said that thought out loud at the time. We just noticed it, mildly annoyed, the way you notice any dead zone. The mapping app, running on cache data with no live signal to update it, showed us sitting on a stretch of unnamed gray line with, as far as either of our phones were concerned, no name and no number. The atlas had a name for it. Old number 9, in the kind of thin red pen line that on every other page of that atlas meant a state highway, printed and official. Except that on page 14 the red line for 9 looked, if you held it at an angle to the light, very slightly less like it had come off a printing press, and very slightly more like it had been drawn. I didn't clock that at the time either. I want to keep being honest about the things I didn't clock, because I think that's the real shape of what happened to us. Not one big mistake, but 4 or 5 small unexamined ones, laid down like a highway of our own making. Grandpa's atlas says there's a road right here, I said, mostly as a joke, tapping the page. Cuts back to the interstate, saves us maybe 40 minutes. Dell looked at the dead mapping app, looked at the gray, unnamed line it was showing us, and said, well, it's not lying about the road existing at least, and took the turn the atlas told us to take, because we were 25, and it was funny to use a dead man's paper map like it still had authority over the world, and because neither of us, not once, considered that a paper map from 1987 and the phone in your pocket, disagreeing about a highway's existence might be a question worth taking seriously. Old number 9 was a good road is the thing. Not eerie, not at first. Long and straight and empty in the specific pleasant way that made Dell put the windows down and me stop narrating mile markers for a while, because there wasn't any nausea to manage, just flat gold country going by. We passed through a town. I want to call it a town, though 4 buildings and a water tower undersells and overstates it depending on the hour, called Averill Junction, and it clocked in on the atlas as 11 miles further down the road than it apparently was, because we hit its one gas station in what felt like half the drive time the map implied, and I remember thinking, distantly, that Grandpa's atlas must have had the scale wrong on this page. Some printing error, the kind of thing that happens to a book nobody's fact-checked in 40 years. There was a church on the way into town, white clapboard, the kind you see 100 of on any stretch of rural highway in this country, with a plastic-lettered reader board out front that had, when we passed it that first time, a verse about the diligent hand and the slothful one, something out of Proverbs, the kind of homily that doesn't stick in your head on purpose, but does anyway. I noticed it exactly once and thought nothing else about it, filed it away with the water tower and the boarded diner as texture, the visual furniture every small town this size seems issued from the same catalog. It would be 2 days before I understood that I should have been counting that sign the same way I counted miles. There was, if I'm being complete about it, one more detail from that first pass through town that I didn't examine until much later. A dog. A big rangy shepherd mix, lying in the shade of the feed store's awning, that lifted its head to watch our car go by with an attention that struck me, even then, as slightly too specific, not the idle look of an animal tracking motion, but something closer to recognition. I told myself it was just a friendly dog liking cars. I have thought about that dog more than almost anything else since, and I still don't know what to do with it, so I'm putting it here and leaving it exactly that unresolved, because I think that's honest. The gas station receipt is the detail I keep coming back to, because it's the first thing that was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the road being unfamiliar, and everything to do with the road not agreeing with time the way everywhere else we'd ever been did. The receipt printed with a date 17 months in the future. Dell showed it to the clerk, more curious than alarmed, and the clerk, an ordinary heavyset guy in his 50s with a name tag that said Hollis and absolutely nothing sinister about him. I want to be clear, because this is not a story about a strange man doing something monstrous. This is a story about a strange man doing something monstrous. This is a story about a machine printing a wrong date, just shrugged and said the register had always run funny out here, and that the owner kept meaning to get a repair guy out from the county seat and never had. We laughed about it in the car. Dell took a picture of the receipt to send his dad as a joke about your old detour road still broken. Except there was no signal to send it, and by the time there was, 2 days later, he didn't send it at all. For reasons I'll get to. We meant to push through to the interstate that night. The atlas said it was close. It was not close, or at least the amount of driving it took to reach anything did not match what the mileage on the page suggested it should, and somewhere around 9 at night, both of us tired in the specific way that makes bad decisions feel reasonable, we hit the only motel old number 9 seemed to have to offer, and decided that continuing to chase a shortcut that had already cost us more time than it saved was a worse idea than just stopping. The Sundowner Motor Court. I want to describe it plainly because it deserves plainness. A single-story L of rooms around a gravel lot, a vacancy sign with a dead letter, so it read Sun Owner, a lobby smelling like old carpet and coffee that had been on the burner since morning. Ordinary. Tired. The kind of place that exists in the actual world in the hundreds, run by actual families for actual decades, not sinister on its face at all. And that ordinariness is, I think now, exactly the point. The wrongness of that place never once announced itself. It waited for us to notice on our own, at our own pace, the way you'd only notice if you were the kind of person who read things too closely. Which, for better or worse, I am. The woman at the desk, 60-some, cardigan, glasses on a beaded chain, had us fill out a physical guest book instead of running a card through any kind of system. For insurance, she said, case of fire, gotta have a paper list of who's in which room, computer's been down for it since the county did the new phone lines. Reasonable. I've stayed at exactly one other place in my life that still did this. An old family fishing lodge, and nobody thought that was sinister either. We signed. Cormac and Dell, room 6, plate number, home state. Ordinary Thursday night motel administration. While Dell showered, I sat on the end of the bed and, because I am the kind of person who reads things too closely, and because there was no signal to do anything else with my hands, I flipped back through the guest book. Not looking for anything, just reading, the way you read a stranger's bookshelf. The names started repeating faster than felt right for a book that size. Not the same 6 names on consecutive pages. That would have been obvious. That would have made me put the book down and say something out loud immediately. But the same 6 or 7 names recurring every 20 or 30 entries, spaced out across what the dates told me were decades. A. Wharton, T. in 1994, room 9. A. Wharton, T. again in 2003, room 9. Again in 2011, room 9, every time. I told myself it was a snowbird, somebody's grandfather who liked this exact motel enough to return every several years on his way through, which people do, which is a completely normal thing for a person to do. What wasn't normal, once I was looking for it, was the handwriting. It wasn't identical across the repeats. If it had been identical, I'd have assumed the desk clerk was filling in blanks herself for some administrative reason and moved on. It drifted. The same T, in the same slightly canted hand, but a little less steady each time it reappeared, a stroke starting to hook the wrong direction, the loop of the W going a little looser and rounder over each returning decade, like watching one's signature grow old across 10-year jumps with no years in between, actually visible on the page. The same hand, aging, but never with the entries you need in between to prove it was one continuous aging person doing all this signing. There were others besides the wardens, once I started actually looking instead of idly flipping. A Delacour Pruitt family, 4 names entered together, appearing in 1979, 1988, and 2002. Always all 4 names together. Always room 3, and always. This is the detail that made me put my thumb down on the page and stop breathing normally for a second. The same 4 ages listed in a little box the book provided for it, decade after decade. A father, a mother, and 2 children whose ages never changed by so much as a year across 23 years of supposed returns. A single entry for someone who'd only written a last name, Okonkwo, no first name, no plate. Appearing exactly once every 11 years going back as far as the book's water-stained first pages would let me read. Which meant doing the arithmetic with a pen on my own arm because I didn't trust myself to hold a number in my head. That the book itself had to be far older than the cover stamped 1970-something by whoever'd rebound it. Actually claimed to be. I told myself, working through each of these, the way you talk yourself down from a bad thought at 3 in the morning, that there were mundane versions of all of it. Families do return to the same motel for generations. Old ledgers do get recopied by hand into new books when the paper wears out, which would explain a continuous hand that was really just one clerk's best guess at replicating an older one. I had almost gotten myself all the way back down to calm by the time Dell came out of the shower, and I very nearly didn't go back to the book at all that night, and I think about that a lot, the version of this story where I let it go at families do return and just went to sleep. I didn't. I was midway through convincing myself the Wharton drift was still explainable. Bad eyesight worsening in old age? What else would you expect? When I found Dell's father's name. Desmond Okafor. Dell's dad, unmistakably. There are not 2 Desmond Okafors likely to have driven this exact stretch of nowhere, and the home state matched, and God help me, I even recognized the loop on the D from birthday cards. 1991, room 6, our room. I sat with that for a second, feeling the specific vertigo of a coincidence too large to be a coincidence. And then I turned the page looking for whatever came next and found him again. Same trip apparently, same year, but a second entry. 11 days later, same room number. In handwriting just fractionally less steady than the first. Dell had always told the story of his dad's college detour as a single long weekend, not 11 days. Never 11 days. I know this because I'd heard the story a dozen times across a dozen years, always the same length, always a week or under, always ending in the same shrug. We got turned around. I did not tell Dell that night. I want to be honest about why, because I don't think it makes me look good, and I think it's important anyway. I didn't tell him because some very old, very stupid part of my brain decided that saying it out loud would make it real in a way that not saying it kept it from being, and because Dell was already asleep by the time I'd worked up to it, and because some other, slightly less stupid part of me was already forming the shape of a plan that involved leaving in the morning and never coming back to this particular motel, or this particular red line on a 40-year-old page, and I thought I thought it sleek, it's a pari of pay, Almink. That is not how it went. We left at 8 the next morning, checked out, gravel crunching, everything ordinary. The mapping app was still dead, still showing us that same nameless gray line, so we navigated by the atlas and by Hollis, the gas station clerk's directions from the day before, both of which agreed that continuing east on old number 9 for about 6 miles would put us back on the Mart Highway. 6 miles. I remember the number specifically because I was counting, because counting was the thing my hands and my mouth did automatically whenever my stomach was uneasy, and my stomach had been uneasy since I'd found that second entry under Desmond Okafor's name. 6 miles took us past the feed store. Fine. 6 more miles took us past the feed store again, from what appeared to be a different direction, though the road hadn't forked anywhere either of us had noticed. Dill made a joke about small towns and looping roads. I laughed thinly. The third time we passed the feed store, same faded sign, same rusted gas pump out front that clearly hadn't dispensed gas since some administration or other, Dell stopped joking. We passed the water tower 4 times. I know it was the same water tower because of the misspelling, Averill Junction, 1L, someone's sign painting mistake decades old and never corrected, And I know we passed it 4 times because I made myself count that too. Once I understood the mile markers weren't going to help me, and each time the number written on the odometer's trip function had climbed by roughly what it should for that distance, except that when I subtracted our total actual displacement where we'd started that morning, where we currently, physically where the math came out negative. We had, by every honest reckoning I could do with a pen on the back of a gas receipt, driven 11 fewer miles than 0 over the course of 3 hours. We had gone backward past a highway we had never left. The church came around a 5th time near noon, and the reader board had changed. Not to a different homily picked at random, to the same one about the diligent hand and the slothful one. Except one word had shifted. Where it had originally read, "The hand of the diligent maketh rich," it now read, "The hand of the diligent maketh him stay," a substitution so small and so grammatically wrong that I made Dell pull the car onto the shoulder so I could get out and look at it directly rather than trust it through a windshield. Up close, the plastic letters were the ordinary kind any church reader board uses, snapped into slotted rails, nothing supernatural about the object itself, which somehow made it worse because it meant somebody, or something, had walked up to that sign with an armful of the same interchangeable letters every church of this kind keeps in a box in a closet, and had made a specific, small, deliberate choice about which word to change, and had done it without either of us seeing a single person anywhere near that stretch of road all day. We tried in the early afternoon to simply drive away from the loop in a direction the atlas didn't recommend. Due south, off old number 9's marked path entirely, onto a dirt track that any normal map would call an equal or better bet than repeating the same 6 miles a 6th time. It bought us 40 minutes of unfamiliar country, scrubland, and a dry creek bed and one collapsed barn before it fed us, with no fork we could identify and no turn either of us remembered taking. Back onto old number 9, roughly a quarter mile from the water tower, going the direction we'd already been going. Dell didn't say anything for a long time after that. Neither did I. I think that was the moment both of us stopped hoping this was a strange but ultimately explicable stretch of confusing rural road and started understanding it as a thing with a will, or at least with a shape, that we were inside of rather than lost on. What I haven't said yet, because it embarrasses me a little even now, is that the afternoon didn't just repeat the same 3 landmarks. It stretched them out far longer than 3 hours should have felt like, the sun doing something wrong overhead that neither of us wanted to be the first to mention, dropping low enough twice to look like early evening and then climbing back toward noon without either of us feeling time pass in between. I kept my hatch marks on the inside of the atlas's back cover the way I kept everything else. One for what my body insisted was a full day's worth of light spent going nowhere, and by the time the church came around that 5th time, there were 2 marks on the page for a single Friday that every phone and every watch in that car still swore was one continuous afternoon. We ran low on gas on a pass-through Hollis station that neither of us had meant to make again, and had to stop anyway, and found the pumps working and Hollis behind the counter looking at us with an expression I couldn't read as anything other than mild, incurious recognition, the specific blankness of a man who has rung up the same 2 tired travelers more times than he's willing to mention out loud. He didn't say we'd been in already that day. Neither did we ask. Dell bought a bag of gas station ice for his own forehead, unprompted, sweating in a way the heat alone didn't explain, and told me, quietly, in the 2 seconds Hollis's back was turned, that he'd started keeping his own count too, separate from mine, some private tally of how many times he thought we'd circled, and that his number and my number didn't match. They were off by exactly 11 in my favor, when we compared them properly back in the car, his private count sitting 11 short of my hatch marks for what should have been the same handful of hours, and neither of us said Desmond Okafor's name out loud right then, but I watched Dell do the arithmetic on his own face and go somewhere private with it, and I let him, because I didn't have anything gentler to offer him than silence. Dell wanted to stop and ask someone. There was no one to ask. That's the detail that still gets me more than almost anything else from that stretch. Not a hostile town, not a suspicious local, not one single person visible anywhere along a road we'd now driven past, the same 3 landmarks a dozen times combined. No cars, no porches, no dog under the feed store awning anymore either, which should have been a relief, and somehow wasn't. We tried it at night. This was Dell's idea, born mostly of exhausted frustration. If the road wouldn't let us leave in daylight, we'd see if dark made a difference. On the theory, unspoken and half a joke, that maybe the town needed to see us go. We killed the headlights for the water tower stretch specifically, my idea, and I couldn't have told you why at the time beyond a hunch that had no evidence behind it yet. Creeping past on parking lights alone, both of us staring dead ahead at the road instead of at the tower or the feed store or anything else. Neither of us checked the mirrors. I remember that specifically because Dell started to, a habitual glance up at the rear view the way anyone does merging or slowing. And I said too sharply for a reason I couldn't have explained, "Don't," and he didn't. And I've never been more grateful for an instinct I couldn't back up with a single fact. We came out on the marked highway, not old number 9 reversing itself, the actual highway with an actual green sign, a route number that matched every map either of us owned. Whooped like idiots. We did not, in our relief, notice for almost another hour that we were 4 miles from the Sundowner again, having somehow returned to the highway closer to the motel than to the town, on a road that should have run the other direction entirely. I told Dell about his father's name in the guest book somewhere around midnight, parked on the shoulder of an entirely normal, entirely explicable stretch of real highway, both of us too keyed up to sleep. I watched something clues behind his eyes when I said 11 days, and watched him do the math I'd already done. A week, always a week. That's the story. That's the story it's always been. And he didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said quietly, he used to write his name on things. After, my mom used to get annoyed about it. Restaurant wait lists, hotel check-ins, he'd sign them like he was worried they'd lose track of him otherwise. She thought it was a control thing. A leftover from something thing. He looked at me. I never once thought about where the something was. We decided that night not to go back to a motel at all. If the book was the thing, if signing something somewhere was doing whatever it was doing, then the plan was simple. Don't sign anything, don't check in anywhere, sleep in the car or, if we had to stop longer, camp off the shoulder like we'd have done on any other unremarkable night of this trip. It felt, for about a day, like a real plan. It felt like we'd found the rule. Saturday was close to normal. We put miles behind us. Real miles. Miles the odometer and the map agreed on. Angling south, aiming for a stretch of interstate, the Atlas, and the phone once signal flickered weakly back for an hour. Both confirmed existed in the same place. We joked less than usual, but we joked. Somewhere in the early afternoon, Dell made me promise, half serious, that whatever happened for the rest of this trip, we weren't telling either of our mothers any of it, ever. A promise that felt at the time like ordinary road trip gallows humor, and that I have, in fact, kept. We stopped near dusk in a stand of scrub pine off the shoulder, nowhere with a name, nowhere with a book, and made camp the ordinary way. And for a few hours it was just 2 friends on the trip they'd always meant to take, tired and dusty and glad of each other's company in the specific, unspoken way you only get to have with someone who's known you since you were 9. We didn't talk about the guest book, or the loop, or Dell's dad. We talked about nothing, a show we both used to watch, a girl Dell had been seeing before the Denver job came through and ended it preemptively. Whether the gas station burritos from 2 mornings ago had been a mistake. I remember being grateful for how normal it felt, and I remember, underneath the gratitude, a low, persistent hum of wrongness that I couldn't locate anywhere specific, the feeling of a held breath in a room you can't identify. It was full dark by the time Dell noticed the front passenger tire had gone soft, not flat, just soft enough to want dealing with before another day of driving on it, and he waved off my offer to help with the particular stubborn independence he'd always had about car maintenance. A leftover, I think, from his dad teaching him young and Dell wanting to prove he'd actually learned it. I stayed by the fire. I want that on the record too. I was 15 feet away, not paying close attention, doing the ordinary unglamorous work of keeping a campfire fed, while my best friend knelt in the dark on ground I never thought to question. I want to describe what happened to Dell's leg carefully, because he lived it and I only watched it. and because I think the ordinary physical horror of it is worse, honestly, than anything the road did with roads or books, and it deserves to be told with some weight rather than rushed past. He was checking a soft tire in the dark, working the jack under the frame by phone flashlight, kneeling on ground that had felt, when he'd tested it with his boot 10 minutes before, completely solid. I was 15 feet away building a fire. I heard the sound before I understood it. A short, flat crack, more concussive than I expected metal and ground to sound together. And I heard Dell make a noise that started as a shout and cut off far too fast, clipped, like something had taken the air out of it partway through. I'm not going to describe the next several seconds. I'll tell you what I found when I got to him with the flashlight, because that part matters for what came after. The jack had come down wrong, the car's weight settling onto his lower leg at an angle no leg is built for, and the shin bone was tenting the skin without breaking through it, a wrongness of shape more than of color that I will never stop being able to picture. The skin gone tight and shining over something that should not have made that shape. Blood was already pooling dark under the surface, spreading slow the way it does under unbroken skin. Nothing dramatic to look at yet, and somehow worse for it. Dell was gray and shaking, and talking in the eerily level voice of someone doing everything they can not to go into shock. By main force of will, telling me it was fine, it was fine. It was fine, we needed to get the weight off, and I got the weight off, and it was not fine. There is no hospital on any map inside that dead zone. I want to say that plainly because it's the detail that turned accident into trap. I checked the atlas by flashlight with Dell's blood on my hands and found nothing within 80 miles that the 1987 page called a hospital, and the one live bar of signal I eventually found on a hilltop gave me a map with nothing either, and the only lit sign anywhere on that stretch of dark country, the only building showing any light at all when I finally, desperately drove us back toward anything, was the Sundowner Motor Court 4 miles away, the lid. I'm not going to pretend I made a brave choice at that point. I drove toward the only light there was because my best friend's leg looked like that, and I did not have another option that existed anywhere in the physical world, and I have made my peace with the fact that the road, if it is the kind of thing that planned on exactly that. The lobby was empty. Not closed lit, coffee still on the burner, door unlocked, just unattended, the cardigan woman nowhere in it, and I did what I did next without deciding to. The way you flinch. I looked at the guest book, open on the counter, and it was open to a blank line, dated for that exact night, and in the margin where the desk clerk would normally have penciled a room number, someone had already written 6 in handwriting that was I want to be as precise as I can be about this, because it's the detail that has cost me the most sleep, instakably, my own, to the spica crooked way I nied, nalbach tendacning sick out. Dell saw it too. I want to be clear about that because for a long time after I half convinced myself I could have been the only one, that grief and fear and no sleep had done something to my eyes alone, and it would be a kinder story if that were true. It isn't. I had him slung across my shoulders in the ugly half-carry you learn from nowhere in particular, and just have to improvise when you need it, his good leg trying weakly to help and the bad one held stiff out to the side the way he'd learned already in 20 minutes, to hold it without being told, and when I stalled out in front of that counter, staring, he followed my stare down out of the same animal instinct that makes you look where someone else is looking. He read their room number waiting there in my handwriting before I'd said a word, and I felt the whole weight of him go rigid against me, and he said, in a voice gone very flat and very quiet, "That's not possible. We've never been in this building before tonight." Which wasn't even true. We'd signed in Thursday plain as anything, except I understood. Watching his face, that some part of him already knew the difference between the two visits mattered more than the fact of them. That this was the second time in the book was already treating it like a return rather than a rival. "Don't look at it again," I told him, which was not a rule I'd worked out yet, so much as a thing that came out of my mouth already sounding true. The same way I told him not to check the rearview mirror out at the water tower, and he didn't. He put his eyes on the hallway ahead of us instead and kept them there the whole time I got him down it and into room 6. And I remember being grateful, in the middle of everything else, that some old wordless part of our friendship still worked exactly the way it always had. I said don't, and he trusted that I had a Lenini's white-eyed badge head. I did not sign it. I want that on the record clearly. I got Dell into a room 6, unavoidably, because there was nowhere else, but I did not put a single mark of either of our names in that book, that night or the next morning, no matter how many times the absence of a signature seemed to make the lobby silence sit heavier, no matter how much some worn, smooth animal part of my brain wanted to just sign the stupid book and make the waiting feeling stop. Dell, feverish that night with a pain that had no business being managed with the half bottle of ibuprofen I had in my bag, became someone I didn't recognize for a few hours. And I think that's worth being honest about too, because the friendship was the other thing at stake here, and he came closer to actually breaking than I've told anyone. He blamed the atlas. He blamed me specifically by name for the stupid dead man's map, for taking the turn, for not just pushing through to a real town that first night. And some of what he said found the exact soft places. 16 years of friendship had taught him where to aim, and for about an hour, sitting on the floor of that room listening to him say those things in a voice that kept catching on a strange, sing-song rhythm at the ends of his sentences, like he was reciting something instead of feeling it, I believed we might come out the other side of this, if we came out at all. As says kidder. Then he stopped, mid-sentence, and said in his own voice again, thin and scared and much more like himself, I'm sorry. That didn't feel like it was all the way mine. And reached for my hand. And I understood that whatever this place was doing, it wasn't only doing it to roads and mileage. It was reaching into whatever was easiest to move, and a scared, hurt 25-year-old's temper was easy to move. I spent that night with the guest book open on the floor beside me, working out what I could, while Dell slept the thin, twitching sleep of someone whose body has finally been given enough over-the-counter painkiller to stop arguing with it. I'm not going to pretend I solved it, because I don't think it's the kind of thing that resolves into a clean rule. But I found a pattern I still believe. The names that repeated were the names that it signed, and the ones that repeated across decades in the same slowly aging hand were, I think, the same people, still somehow arriving, still somehow leaving, over and over, on some loop the book was keeping score of, rather than describing. Desmond Okafor's second entry, 11 days after the first, wasn't a second trip. I think it was the same trip, failing to finish leaving the first time and having to be let go of twice. I found one more thing that night that I haven't mentioned yet because I still don't know what to make of it. And I'm choosing to put it down plainly rather than dress it up as more significant than it might be. On the inside back cover of the guest book, in pencil, so faint I only caught it because I was holding the book up close to a flashlight. Someone had written a short list of names with no dates and no room numbers at all. Just names. 20 or so of them, in a hand I didn't recognize from anywhere else in the book. Wharton was on it. Delacroix Pruitt, all four, grouped together the way they always signed. Okonkwo. And near the bottom an ink slightly fresher than the pencil around it, like it had been added later by someone else entirely, Okafor. I did not find our names on that list. I want to be honest that I looked, and I did not find them. And I have never decided whether that was reassurance or only meant we hadn't been added yet. Dell surfaced once more out of that thin, twitching sleep, lucid for a few minutes in a way the fever hadn't allowed for hours, and found me still cross-legged on the floor with the book open across my knees, and instead of asking me to stop, which is what I expected, he asked to see it. I held it where the flashlight caught it, and he went quiet for a long time over the Okafor entries, tracing the second signature with one finger without touching the page, and then he said the thing I hadn't let myself say yet, which was that his father had never once, in Dell's whole life, told that story the same way twice in exact words, but had always, without fail, told it for exactly as long as it takes to say a week, no more, no less, like a man reciting a line he rehearsed until the truth underneath it had gone smooth. He wasn't lying to us, Dell said. I think he actually believed the short version by the time he was telling it to me. That scared me worse than anything in the book itself. The idea that the road didn't just take days. It went back afterward and edited what the person carrying them remembered having lost. He handed the book back to me a few minutes later, eyes already going heavy again, and this time when he went under it looked like real sleep rather than the pain wearing him down between arguments with itself. I decided sometime around 4 in the morning, with Dell finally asleep and breathing evenly enough, that I let myself believe the leg, whatever else was true, was not about to kill him outright, that we were not signing anything else going forward, and that we were not looking back at anything going forward, and that we were not looking back at anything going forward, and that if those two rules were wrong, I would at least have tried something rather than waited to see what the book wanted to write about us next. We left at first dark the next evening, Sunday, because I did not trust daylight on this road anymore, and I did trust, a little, whatever it was about darkness that had gotten us onto the real highway once already. I got Dell into the back seat, leg splinted, as well as I knew how, unsigned, unregistered, no mark of either of us left on that counter, and I drove. I am not going to tell you the rest of that drive calmly, because it wasn't calm, but I'll tell you what happened as plainly as I can. The town tried its trick twice more. The feed store, unmistakable even in headlights, sliding past on the wrong side of the road from where it should have been, twice, and both times I kept driving straight through without slowing, without correcting, on the theory that stopping to figure out where I actually was would be exactly the kind of looking back the road wanted for me. The odometer, for one stretch I can measure only because I'd been obsessively logging our numbers the whole trip, read a full 10 miles of highway as 0 distance and 0 elapsed time. The trip counter simply did not move for what felt, by the position of the moon and by Dell's ragged breathing beside me, like a genuine 11 or 12 minutes of real driving. And then it resumed counting normally, as if apologizing for the gap. And once, only once, and I have never told anyone this detail before tonight, not even Dell, I checked the driver's side mirror out of pure animal habit, not the rear view, just the side mirror, the smallest possible glance, and the Sundowner's lit sign was in it, not receding the way a past building recedes, sitting, holding its distance in that mirror for far longer than the miles I was covering should have allowed, a small square of light keeping perfect pace with a car doing 70, for what felt like 2 or 3 full minutes before it finally, correctly began to fall away and shrink and disappear the way a normal light behind a normal car is supposed to. Somewhere in that same stretch, with Dell drifting in and out behind me and the radio finding nothing but static in both directions, I found myself talking out loud without entirely meaning to. Not to Dell, not to myself, just talking. The way you might talk to a dog you're trying to keep calm. Telling the windshield and the dark beyond it that we were passing through, that we weren't staying, that we didn't have anything for it, over and over in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. I don't know if that helped. I don't know if anything I did that night helped, or if we simply got lucky in a way the road allows a small percentage of the time, a valve it lets blow off pressure now and then to keep the rest of the machine believing escape is possible. I choose most days to believe the rules I worked out mattered. It's a better way to have lived through it. We crossed onto real marked highway a little after 5 in the morning, and both our phones lit up at once with the specific aggressive flood of notifications that means you've been out of signal a long time, and I have never in my life been so glad to see a highway sign with a number on it that matched a number on a phone. Dell's leg turned out, under an ordinary hospital's ordinary imaging equipment 3 hours later, to be a bad tibial fracture, complicated, ugly, requiring a rod and a long recovery, but explicable, a jack failure, a bad angle, the kind of accident that happens to people changing tires in the dark every single day in perfectly ordinary places. No doctor who looked at that leg ever asked a question that suggested they thought it was anything other than exactly what it looked like. I signed exactly nothing at that hospital that I hadn't signed 100 times before at other hospitals for other ordinary reasons, and I noticed myself noticing that, and I am not going to pretend that feeling has ever fully gone away. Here's where I'd like to tell you the story ends, and where, if I'm honest, I don't think it does. Dell is fine. I want to say that clearly and mean it, because it's true in every way that matters for how he lives his life now. The leg healed. Badly in the sense that he'll ache before rain for the rest of his life, and well in the sense that he walks and runs and does his new job in Denver and calls me. Still, more than twice a month, which I choose to take as its own small victory over everything the last few months of that friendship's old shape were supposedly going to do. To us, to us. But he tells his father's old college story differently now, not dramatically. You'd have to know him and know the story the way I do to catch it at all. He says 11 days now, not a week, correcting himself mid-sentence sometimes with a small confused laugh, like a fact that used to live in one place in his memory has quietly relocated to another one, and he only half notices the move each time it happens. I've never told him why I think that is. I don't think I ever will. And he writes his name down now on things that don't require it. Restaurant wait lists that just want a first name and a number of people. Hotel registries that have a perfectly functional computer system sitting 3 feet from the paper guest book nobody's required to use. He'll reach for the pen before the pen's even offered, the way his father apparently used to, and I've watched his handwriting on those pages over the months since. The same small drift I once traced across 40 years in a motel guest book in a town that isn't on any map I've ever been able to find again. I visited him in Denver 2 months ago, the first time either of us had made the trip since the accident, and we did the thing old friends do where you fall immediately back into the exact rhythm you left off in. No scheduling required after all, no appointment needed to make it feel like it always has, and for most of the weekend I let myself believe I'd worried for nothing, that whatever I'd watched happen to him was a scar and not an open wound. Then, on the last night, waiting for a table at a restaurant that used a tablet for its wait list, and had for its entire 2 years of existence, he asked the host, unprompted, cheerfully, whether they had a book he could sign instead, just in case, and laughed it off when she looked at him strangely, and ordered a drink and was, for the rest of the night, completely and entirely himself. I didn't say anything. I have gotten very good this last year at not saying anything, and I no longer feel good about how good I've gotten at it. I don't know if not signing that book actually got us both out clean. I've turned that over more nights than I'd like to admit. Some part of me thinks the road only ever let one of us all the way go, and that it kept the other one anyway, just quietly, just in the parts of him too small to notice missing. I've never found old number 9 again on any map since, paper or otherwise, and I've looked, spread my grandfather's atlas open on my own kitchen table, more nights than I'd admit to anyone but you. My grandfather's atlas still has that ring on page 14. I know now it isn't coffee. It's a burr mark, the exact size and shape of something set down still hot, right on top of a road that, as far as I can tell, only that one book in the world still remembers, and one more hand, 3 states away, that hasn't fully stopped signing for it. And that's where he leaves it. The Graveyard Slot airs twice a week, new stories in the dead hours wherever you're hearing this. If tonight kept you company, follow the show on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube. It matters more than it should. And if something ever happened to you, something you've been carrying, something nobody believed, write it down and send it in. The address is thegraveyardslot.com. We read them as written. Until next time then, keep your porch light on, not because it helps, because it's polite to whatever's watching. This has been The Graveyard Slot. We're off the air.